My question concerns with guilty pleasures. Um, so things where we set some rule for ourselves, and when we break, um, there is definitely pleasure in that action of itself, but there is also some, because of breaking we set for ourselves.
There's some pleasure from that. Is that what you're saying?
Not a pleasure, but it's like a relief. It's a sense of relief. Maybe I shouldn't generalize to say we, but at least to me, there is some. Um, but then there is also the underlying guilt going on that I, even though, so to take an example of a hot shower, I know it's not a good use of energy, but it feels good, and um, but there is also this underlying feeling of guilt which ends up peaking once the activity is done. And I guess my question is, how to, I mean, I'm not framing this very well, but
It's clear so far.
so there is some self-awareness going on which is causing the guilt, and I'm wondering if we can harness that to something deeper. And the reason that my intuition suggests that that could be possible is because I'm also sensing that relief that these rules are made up.
Is that good? I get a picture.
Sorry?
Are you done? I get a picture.
Yeah, unless there are something I didn't explain well.
No, it's okay. So, I think it's most helpful to think of spiritual practice, our spiritual direction, or our deepest intention for our life, to be clearly about joy, the most joyful life. So, one problem we can find with how kind of the dominant Judeo-Christian religious paradigm in this culture, and perhaps many conventional religious paradigms in other cultures, and perhaps it's a misunderstanding, but there's an idea that there's something wrong with joy, and it's immoral somehow. It's inherently selfish. And to be religious or spiritual, we have to deprive ourselves of joy, ostensibly for the sake of others, or for the sake of purity, or for the sake of making God happy, or something like that. So I think that's a pretty unwholesome, unhealthy understanding. it means we're living for some ideology, and we're making ourselves unhappy, which really just creates frustration, makes us less able to let go, makes us less able to be compassionate and present for others, for ourselves. So I think it's a misunderstanding of the idea that exists in many religions about moderation, about not indulging in sense pleasures. But it's not about because you don't deserve the pleasure or something wrong with pleasure. It's a matter of indulgence being out of balance and actually leads to not deep enjoyment. That's all. It's just a perception that moderation leads to greater enjoyment than overindulgence. And moderation might look quite austere to the way of life in modern global culture today. So the Buddha famously advocated the middle way, not punishing yourself or living a real austere ascetic life, but also not indulging in too much comfort, too much sense pleasure, because it leads to a desiring mind and to becoming very dependent on those pleasures, so when they're not there, you get very upset. So instead, we can understand the middle way as a kind of openness to all the variety of experience, a wide palette, so you can learn to enjoy physical comfort, but also you can learn that physical discomfort is not so bad. And cold on your skin feels nice, as does warm on your skin. That it all can be embraced. So that's my understanding of the middle way. So, when we look into the details of what the Buddha recommended, it was, not eating a lot and not just having enough clothes to keep you warm enough, and just having the possessions that you really need for your daily tasks. For monks, it would just be a begging bowl and a couple of other things, water filter and needle and thread. So in a warm climate where people give you offerings of food to survive on, that might be enough, that might be reasonable. We might need a little more in this culture and climate. But the point is to find joy in the variety of human experience and not to be dependent on some indulgence that we can become like an addiction and we can want more and more of it. But it's not about something wrong with joy or pleasure. So hot showers are nice. I like them and I enjoy them. But for me, once a week increases the joy. If I took them every day, it would be not at all special, and I don't think it would feel as precious. And cold showers are joy too, a different kind of joy. A little shock at first, a little hard to jump into. But once you're in the midst of it, and certainly right after, it's exciting, it's stimulating and enlivening. Just like it's really good to exercise hard sometimes. It feels good to get that energy flowing, and then it feels really nice to just lie down and go to sleep at the right time. Just relax in your warm covers. So we want to experience the variety. And if we have that kind of moderation, our impact on the world is naturally, I think, fairly appropriate. Technology makes it a little more confusing. So we're used to, for example, driving in cars all the time. And that has an outsized impact, bigger than we can know. And also the things people buy have an outsized impact because they come from so far away and they're kind of hidden to us. So we're not intimately, physically involved in the retrieval or creation of those things. And so we're kind of disjointed from the impact on the world. So that takes a little more kind of reflection to see how we can interact with some of those things in a moderate way. But once a week shower is nice. A lot of traditional cultures that were fairly sustainable might have a way to have a nice hot bath once a week. Maybe they were communal, which maybe is the ideal. You heat a big bath for a bunch of people. You travel to a hot spring for a celebration. You have a nice fire for a celebration. I hope to have a fire for a solstice gathering we have in a couple weeks. But if you have a fire every day, when you don't need it for cooking, or for some essential warmth in your house, that might be a bit much. You might make a lot of smoke. You might use too much wood. And might make it less special and actually less pleasurable.
Well said.
Thanks. But guilt is a interesting and not so desirable emotion. Just last night, actually, I was watching a thing online about trauma. And this one therapist had this model of an upside-down triangle. And at the bottom of the triangle are these core emotions like fear, anger, also excitement, sexual desire, joy. And often we were taught in early childhood inadvertently that some of these things are not good. Even the positive ones maybe we're taught are not good. We're taught we're behaving. If we're too excited or joyful, we're taught we're looking silly and we should stop that. And certainly if we have anger and fear, we're sometimes taught that's no good. And so we start to suppress those things and cover them over. And that goes to the right side of the triangle, the kind of suppressive emotions, and that's guilt and shame. And we develop those, and they become kind of common things. And then, forgetting what's on the left side of the triangle.
Guilt and shame are on the same side as fear, anger, and desire?
No, that's the point pointing down. The core emotions are at the bottom. On the upper right is the suppressive kind of emotions, guilt and shame and anxiety. And then on the upper left is I can't remember. but the point is we can recognize guilt and shame as things that are working to suppress the expression of our core emotions. And when we recognize that, and we let ourselves feel it, we can then open and go down the triangle to those core emotions and let ourselves feel those core emotions. And then when we let them come out, then we can move on to this very centered place of peace and balance and confidence and relaxation.
It can be dangerous as well. When a person is recovering from trauma, and the fear, anger, and desire that are suppressed start becoming expressed,
Oh, I see.
it can get out of control.
Yeah, it should be done in a careful way, right?
It's creating a safe space, I've found, is important to begin to access those buried memories and repressed emotions.
Yeah.
Because it disturbs the peace sometimes.
Well, my main point is to notice when we're having guilt or shame that it's functioning there to cover something else up. And when our conscious mind thinks that the guilt and shame is making us a good person, that's a not a very clear perception, not a very helpful perception. That instead of trying to live a life of restraint, meaning you basically think your core emotions are bad and you need to restrain them, which just creates more frustration and ill mental health, actually. We can recognize that if those are released, we have a natural store of peace and contentment. And that's what leads to a really wholesome life, both for oneself, for one's own pleasure, and for compassionate interaction with others. But we don't need that guilt and restraint that comes from it to make us good people. That our true goodness is our just naturally unrestrained flowing state.
Is there a difference?
But there's work there to do. I mean, there's care needed to know what's a core emotion without a story, and what's just acting out a story that's actually repressing something else. Our stories kind of justify our difficult feelings instead of letting ourselves just feel our difficult feelings and let go of the story. That's how we can return to that centered, content place. Acting out our frustrations from the stories, while clinging to the stories, usually leads to pretty unwholesome behavior. So I think, ultimately, we need to not think of our practice or our moral compass as a set of rules we have to follow. That creates tension and suppression of emotions and anxiety, and that leads us, and frustration, and it leads us to become more unwholesome, whether it's hidden or not. So instead, that's why there's that relief of breaking the rules. Oh, I don't have to be limited. We want to be guided by freedom, by true freedom. And freedom doesn't have rules. But we make rules sometimes, and they're sometimes helpful, especially interpersonal relations need some rules, but we make rules just because we're not always able to be very careful. When we're able to be really reflective and careful, we can let go of rules and just find out what's going on in our body minds and let how we're feeling arise and be felt. And then watch it settle and watch our natural peace and contentment come, and trust that from that contented, centered place, we behave beautifully. whether for self or others. We have a perspective that's, doesn't seek indulgence, but doesn't want to indulge in asceticism either. It doesn't have any agenda or any rules. It's just very natural. And that's what our heart's wanting, not to be restrained by rules. And that's why we feel uncomfortable when we're restrained by rules, whether someone else's or ourselves. So what rules we have, we should recognize these are just guidelines to help me remember that there's a really natural way beyond rules that I sometimes forget about because I get caught up in some kind of guilt, shame dynamic that obscures my vision. And so the rules or guidelines or precepts, whatever we want to call them, we can use just to remember a deeper place to turn to. But once we've turned to that deeper place, we don't really need the rules. We just need to be focused on coming from that deeper place. And then we can just trust any behavior that comes out is okay. Does that make sense?
But we can't trust that around other people.
We can trust that same process will work for other people, but we don't know if other people are doing that process. We can't assume they are. We can only do it for ourselves. We can suggest it to other people, but then it's up to them to do.
He asked the question, if there was a way that the guilt could be, the self-awareness contained in the guilt could be harnessed. And I wish to interrogate that question a little more deeply, because if it is real self-awareness, then it's also aware of the underlying core emotions that unaware guilt is suppressing. So a self-aware guilt could be different than just the compulsive guilt and shame that so often dominates our lives when we live repressed. But to harness the fear, anger, and desire is my understanding of the purpose of the restraints, or the yamas in yoga. And I wonder if you or anyone else here has aware of the yamas and niyamas in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and how those might be used to invoke these uncomfortable emotions in a way that is life-affirming. Harness them, in other words.
So the yamas and niyamas are another set of what I was talking about, these guidelines or precepts or whatever we choose to call them, things that can remind us about a wholesome state. But I think, without getting too complicated, I don't know if it's harnessing the guilt or what words you want to use, but when we're feeling guilt or shame, we shouldn't increase the guilt and shame by saying it's bad to have guilt or shame and feel guilty or shameful about having guilt or shame, right? We just want to feel them and then recognize they're there covering something up. They're there as a response to something being suppressed. You use them. So you're not pushing them away. You notice it. Oh, I'm feeling this thing. You just use it to look. First, just let yourself feel it. And then see if there's something more simple, which we're calling the core emotions, that's beneath it, something that's been suppressed, something we felt that we weren't letting ourselves fully feel at some point in our lives, and we maybe made a habit of that. Just using it to open ourselves up, using it as a springboard to just kind of, what's going on? You can say in your body, but that includes your mind. What in my body-mind is not being able to be expressed, or is maybe shut off or clogged, or whatever word we want to use. It's more helpful to think of it in your body, because if you think of it, what's going on in my mind, it can get very complicated, and you get very mental, and you start to detach from feeling what your body's feeling. But when you're feeling your body, you're using your mind already, as observation. So the mind body are both included. So it's a little more helpful, I think.
Seer abides in his own essence.
So sometimes it's a good practice, I think, to really, if you're not sure, if a rule is a reminder of something natural or if it's some tool of a suppressive habit in your body-mind, break your rules sometimes. If the rule was a good one and you break it, you won't feel so good breaking it. Not just because of guilt, but your body-mind won't be so joyful and free. It just won't feel that way. Whereas if you break your rule and you really feel relieved and happy and it doesn't seem to cause any problem, then maybe the rule wasn't so good. Right? If you think, well, I'm really enjoying this, but I know it's hurting the earth, just sit with that for a while. Is it really enjoyable for you, or is it really harming the earth? Because I think those things that really harm the earth are not so enjoyable, really. Or other people, of course.
No, but that also depends on your level of awareness, right?
Yeah, it all depends on your level of awareness. Try to be as aware as you can. There's no shortcut for being aware. But that doesn't mean you have to have some deep philosophical understanding. It's just willingness to feel what you're feeling and just observe carefully with kindness and attention. Being willing to be kind of being willing to start fresh with no assumptions. You've been doing something for a long time, but now that I'm not sure about it, if that comes up, you just start fresh. Saying, what feels nice this morning? I have a lot of practices, I do in the morning. And I think that's helpful and joyful to do practices in the morning, especially physical practices. But like yesterday, I didn't do a lot of them. Just decided to have a day where I didn't do a lot of them and see how that felt. And I think that's good once in a while. It didn't feel as good as doing them. I partly did it because I hadn't gotten good sleep, beforehand. But shaking it up is good. Find out your natural awareness of what a peaceful, content, centered mode of being expresses itself as. And know that we have a lot of habits that aren't so wholesome, a lot of habits that come out of childhood trauma of one kind or another. A lot of habits built on shame and guilt and ideology and all kinds of old stories that aren't serving us. And experiment with practices. If you live in a community that's all doing practices together, then you have a little less freedom to totally experiment. But joining such a community is itself an experiment, And if you really feel this isn't wholesome practices, then that's not the right community for you. But people doing practices together is very helpful because it helps people get out of habit mind and try something they wouldn't do on their own. The group energy helps. A lot of spiritual contemplative traditions have even if they might be pretty strict about practices in order to break our habitual tendencies, then you get a habitual tendency about the practices and a sense of purity about the practices, and then often those need to be broken. So, in Tibetan Buddhism, they have feast days, sok days, called sok tantric feasts, where you break a lot of taboos. You break some of the purity rules that you often keep in spiritual practice. And
But the goal of that is slightly different, right? It's to break your identity as
that pure person.
as that person who does
Yeah.
this or that.
Yeah, maybe that's not so different as what you were describing. I'm a pure person that doesn't take hot showers, but I really like them. And you get to take a hot shower, enjoy it fully, and then contemplate. If I did this every day for 20 minutes, is that really so joyful? Hot tubs are nice, but if you stay in them too long, you get exhausted, your skin gets all wrinkly. It's like this idea about food, that the tastiest food is the food that's bad for you. And the healthiest food it's good for you, but it doesn't taste so good. But that's a very superficial perspective. When you give more attention to it, healthy food is really tastier. There's this one guy who was involved in San Francisco Zen Center in its founding, Ed Brown, and he became particularly known for being a chef and writing these cookbooks and bread books. But he used to do workshops where you have a piece of orange and a potato chip and an Oreo cookie. And I think they start with the potato chip. Instead of just eating it quickly, because the potato chip has the oil and the salt that's instinctually exciting, and we just shove them in our mouth. But if you just put the potato chip on your tongue and just let it sit there for a while, and really give attention to what it feels like, it's not so good. It gets kind of like cardboardy. In the oil, you can kind of taste the rancidity. And then if you're using that same careful observation and you eat a Oreo cookie, or any kind of cookie, any kind of commercial cookie, you can kind of, I don't know, you can taste the artificial chemicals or not, but it's kind of gross. You taste the effect of that excess of sugar, and then you put an orange on your mouth and taste that, and it really tastes good. It really tastes good if you give it a lot of attention. And the pleasure is not separate from the feeling in your body. The taste in your mouth is not separate from the feeling that it creates in your body, where it is with junkier food. The excitement of junkier food is kind of requires not really giving full attention to it, just being really habitual. And that's true not just with food, but with so many things we do in our lives. So again, those rules are just helping us get that deeper pleasure. But if we're not sure it is, we should stop the rule for a minute and go back to feeling the other thing and really give it attention and see what's really creating that, getting to that peaceful contentment kind of mode of being. So much better to learn to stop eating junk food because you noticed it doesn't really bring a deeper sense of joy than to do it because of some rule that you feel guilty about eating junk. That kind of suppressive rule-based ethics is not going to lead to a very joyful demeanor. If you don't have a joyful demeanor, you're not going to be very helpful to other beings. You're going to be very ethical in the deeper sense. So you want to replace your superficial joys that are actually problematic, or your superficial attractions, we might say, they're not really deep joy, with deeper joys. And when you're adjusting that, it takes a period of learning and watching. My friend Donna read me a quote from the Bhagavad Gita the other day. that Krishna is saying something to that effect, that the best spiritual practice is not restraining your bad impulses, but replacing them with something more joyful, which could be devotion to the divine in whatever form that takes for you. Does anyone have something else?
There's a principle stated in many religious traditions: love your friend or love your neighbor as yourself. And that's how it's stated in the book of Leviticus. But similar ones are elsewhere, and I wonder how this can be used as a principle to both restrain and to create pleasurable experiences. Or if you think that that is a valid rule or command, if you will.
Be careful about commands. I don't think we like to be commanded. Love your neighbor as yourself. I read from a biblical scholar that that's not as beautiful as a term as we might think these days. But I like the beautiful version of it, but I think the word used for neighbor is like someone within your own kind of clan, which kind of leaves out all the other people. But let's make it universal. From the contemplative point, it's not a rule you should do in order to be a good person according to someone's ideological position, which is just conditioning and suspect to being problematic. But it's a pointer to a reality. Love your neighbor as yourself because your neighbor is yourself. Realize your neighbor is yourself is another way of putting it. Meaning realize the other that comes into your life is your life experience. When you let go of the idea of the story of you as a separate being and the story of someone else as a separate being, there's just the apprehension of a person. And that's your life. So you should love it. Not a particular character with certain descriptions, but the being that's appearing in your awareness. That's your life. And so we take care of our life. It's just a beautiful way to be. To fully appreciate our life. A being stepping into our field of vision is our life happening. There's nothing else to love that's real. We can attach to an ideology, but love can only really happen when we are fully attentive, fully alive. And we're only fully attentive and alive with what's occurring in awareness. It's undivided. When our attention is undivided. So if we're relating to another person and comparing to another person, our attention is divided into what's actually happening and into a bunch of complicated ideologies. But when we're just deeply aware and sensitive with another being, with no division, that's love. Anything else? That's maybe good for today.